Hey everyone, and welcome to the unofficial Unreal Engine podcast, where we talk about Unreal Engine and missing AA batteries.
Yeah, that's one of the major themes of tonight, right?
Absolutely.
That and whiskey, I guess.
And a little whiskey.
Well, we're your hosts, Jacob and Alex. Before we get started, subscribe on whatever platform you're watching or listening or whatever it is you're doing, and make sure you leave us a rating wherever that is. We're very excited to get things started again. This is episode 2.
Thanks everyone for your feedback,
Yes.
by the way, on episode 1. That was great and absolutely helps us figure out what the heck this show is going to be.
Exactly, right. So I heard you were playing with Lumen and Nanite in Unreal 5.1. Give us some context there. What does that mean for maybe folks who don't know some of these words?
Sure. Okay. So yes, we're going to cover a little bit of Lumen in VR in particular in 5.1 and Nanite. For those who don't know, the reason that a lot of people got real happy and excited about Unreal Engine 5 when it was first announced in what feels like 8 years ago, but was like
Really,
maybe
yeah.
2 years ago, was this idea of being able to have global illumination in real time, lighting your scene, being able to move light around, have bounces of that light, have that all processing in real time, and also having billions and billions of triangles with geometry. You heard Jacob in the last episode give a pretty cool breakdown of a technical talk that goes into Nanite.
Yeah.
But Nanite, once again, is the ability to have almost like pixel level LODs, levels of detail, where it's okay to have billions of polygons in your scene because Unreal Engine isn't really going to be processing more than what it can register at that particular resolution. And for Unreal Engine 5, that initial release, the 5.0 release, and as well as the early access one that came out about a year and a half ago, was really targeted at games. And I want to say like general games. So things like virtual reality, things like ICVFX, things like foliage, translucency, these were not supported by Lumen and Nanite. However, with Unreal Engine 5.1, there is kind of a first pass at starting to bring this support to the fold. I've been playing in particular with the VR side of this for some time now and wasn't having a lot of luck. I was getting lots of crashes, very, very low frame rates, and I finally kind of hit on something of a working model for like, okay, this is like a good frame rate and it's running and it looks beautiful and I kind of just want to sit in a dark room with glowing orbs and meditate.
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty surprising for me. I got to try out a bit of what he was working on, and seeing light bouncing around inside of VR was pretty cool. And actually, to kind of give some more context here, I think one of the big things that people kind of expect jumping into real-time and game engines that maybe they're used to seeing in other content or maybe other workflows like Maya, Houdini, other DCCs that are not real-time. Global illumination is this huge topic, right? Global illumination is about how light bounces around the scene and interacts between objects. It's a very complex thing to reproduce in real time, and for most of games history, it's been a trade-off between, frame rate and performance, and then, kind of a realistic and reactive lighting system. And Lumen was so exciting for a lot of us because it came to the table, and then all of a sudden it can do real-time. So like you can move a light, and things in your scene are going to change. And at the same time, it really kind of captures the quality of bounce lighting that a lot of folks were looking for, particularly in stuff like, ArcViz and, places where previously you were relying upon things like baked lighting and other kind of tricks of the trade to get things right.
Yeah, baked lighting could process as many bounces of light as you wanted, and that could look very beautiful, but that light is then baked and you can't change it.
Right.
Then you have, stationary lights, which for those who don't know, allows you to bake a light but still change something like the intensity of the light and the color. But then movable light, you would think that that is the best ideal version of light to do. But in Unreal Engine 4, there were a lot of limitations with movable light, including a very high overhead, so you couldn't get a particularly great frame rate with it a lot of the time, and you weren't getting bounced light from it. So if you had a movable light hitting an object, you'd get a very hard shadow behind it. You know, things like the skylight and other things like maybe an ambient cube map might start to give the illusion of bounced light and global illumination, but it was tricks.
Yeah, and one last thing I'll add there is that there is one of the kind of harder things to understand is the difference between, for example, things you might hear about like real-time ray tracing versus what like Lumen is based off of. Real-time ray tracing kind of came, you know, maybe a year or two before what we saw with Lumen. The biggest difference is that real-time ray tracing was essentially a way of kind of denoising like the older way of doing things. It had a bunch of acceleration, and it was very novel. But the difference between that and what Lumen does is that Lumen, A, gets far better performance. B, it supports things like essentially accumulating your detailed and bounced lighting over time, which is super valuable for a bunch of use cases where maybe you don't necessarily need lighting to be instantly accurate, but like a few frames is okay. And that was something that like ray tracing just simply didn't handle. In addition to all sorts of caveats like mesh deforming and I don't know. There's really just a bunch of caveats that we had to kind of deal with ray tracing or like real-time ray tracing as compared to Lumen, which to some extent actually does still do quote-unquote ray tracing. You'll see like in the editor, for example, you'll see like do hardware accelerated tracing and stuff like that. So it's still in there, but it is a fundamentally different system. And maybe sometime we can do a deeper dive on it.
Yeah, the one other thing I'll add there is Lumen uses what are called mesh distance fields, which are kind of these texture-based, approximate, almost like wax sculptures of all the geometry in the scene, which is much faster for approximating the lighting. And also we haven't mentioned reflections, like the real-time reflections you can get from Lumen, especially if you're piggybacking off of hardware ray tracing, can look wonderful. So yeah, to be in VR with like a rolling chrome ball
so cool.
that's reflecting the whole scene as it rolls is very exciting.
Yeah, maybe you can also help folks understand a little bit more about why that's particularly challenging in VR.
Yeah, it's challenging in VR. I mean, everything's challenging in VR first and foremost because you're rendering something twice, and to make sure people don't feel sick, you're rendering it ideally at 90 or even 120 frames a second, both those eyes, and you want it to be at as high of a resolution as possible. There's headsets like the Pimax and the Valve Index, which can support very, very high resolutions for each eye, and that's a challenge. So often you're spending a lot of time optimizing the scene, trying to reduce your draw calls, trying to reduce the polygonal count, baking all your lighting, and the idea of all the features we just mentioned of Lumen and Nanite starting to come to VR start to mean that the same reason everyone else not using VR and some of the other things I mentioned that Lumen and Nanite have not supported yet is exciting, is because now we can start to have a little bit less concern about the technical requirements of making something work for VR. And now we can potentially just start to think more about being creative. We can have a larger scene that's using hero assets. We can have light that's doing some very exciting things and have a level of realism that just comes as part of that Lumen Nanite combination.
Yeah. I'm actually, one of the things that kind of popped in my head is I'm curious if given the fact that trace is happening against like distance fields, if actually you end up saving render time in addition to the linear benefits, because if you're rendering both eyes, like it's the same distance. I don't know. I have all sorts of questions. If people want to like comment down below about like either things that we've gotten kind of incorrect in this summary, I would love to learn more about this. Because there's really just so much to talk about this. But tell people a little bit about how you got it working. Like I'm curious what you figured out here.
Yeah, I feel like I owe the community a proper tutorial on this because I've been working on this for a while. And I guess I didn't want to give a tutorial that was not showing the right way to do this. But first and foremost, I'd recommend opening up the VR template, This is assuming that you're on 5.1 preview by this point, or something like that, or maybe you've grabbed the source code from GitHub. Anyone, by the way, can grab whatever the latest version is of Unreal Engine. It's totally public. There's a little bit of a process to access that, but there's nothing special about what Jacob and I do in order to get access to an early release of Unreal Engine here.
But you can tell your friends it's special.
You can tell your friends it's special. You can say, oh, I got special access.
Actually, on GitHub, it does tell you you're part of Epic Games.
That's right, yeah.
So you can say, like, oh, I work on Fortnite, and like, show them a screenshot.
And they'll say, can you give me V-Bucks?
Yeah.
Then you'll deal with that. So I recommend starting with the VR template. This was created by Victor Brodin over at Epic, and it's a really excellent starting point. It uses OpenXR, and now uses the, I believe it's called the Enhanced Input System, which we can talk about more another time. And then you just want to start with changing a few settings in there. It should already have DirectX 12 enabled, but if you want to use Nanite and you want Nanite to work well, you're also going to want to enable another DirectX 12 setting for SM6, which I believe stands for Shader Model 6. Yep. You're also going to want to make sure Generate Mesh Distance Fields is checked, which it should be already. And very important, most templates in Unreal Engine actually are using deferred rendering. This one is using forward rendering or forward shading, and that's because that's what runs by far most efficiently in VR. If you want to be able to use Lumen and Nanite in VR, you need to uncheck that. So no forward rendering shading, it needs to be deferred, and you access that just by unchecking that. Now from that point, I had things that were working like a little bit, but they'd glitch and crash pretty quickly. So first thing I did to actually get things to run smoother is to uncheck that supports hardware ray tracing on my computer. So I'm only using software ray tracing. I'm not taking advantage of all the extra punch you can get from reflections and lighting using ray tracing, so that saves some overhead. But the biggest console variable I started to play with that just made everything stabilize is one that is VR.pixel density and then a number between 0 and 1. And so what I found was no matter how simple my scene was for VR using Lumen and Nanite, it would crash. I'd get like a DirectX error, and it would crash. And that was with pixel density set to 1. As soon as I started to bring that down to 0.8, 0.7, 0.5, everything stabilized. Everything got smoother. And that's something that you can set up. If you're going to use VR Preview in Editor, then make sure you set that up with your CVARs there. You can even put it in one of your ini files. I think the game engine ini file in your config settings.
Yes.
Yeah, so you could just literally have in there VR.pixel density 0.5, and then increase that, decrease that at runtime. I also have it in my level blueprint at begin play. And then the other problem I was running into that has recently been solved is doing a build. Once you would build the project, it would do something very weird when you'd press play, when you'd open it up, where everything would be rendering in your left eye, which made you feel like you were having a stroke. Your left and your right eye were both being compressed into your left eye. And the way to fix that is actually to disable instanced stereo or instanced VR in your project settings, which again adds some overhead, but doing things like lowering the pixel density help to compensate that. So that solves that. And then I do find now that my built executables run very, very smooth. VR Preview, a little bit of a lower frame rate. I do want to mention that VR Mode, formerly known as the VR Editor, actually runs the smoothest. And I don't know if that's like a resolution thing or what, but pop into any scene that's using Lumen and Nanite, and if you've got a VR headset plugged in, you should get that little VR Mode icon that's in the top toolbar. Try popping into that. I've done that with a bunch of example scenes, and it's very cool to just move around that way.
Yeah, cool. And I think like we said, once you kind of get that working, it's very fascinating to see what kind of results you can get with Lumen. Because you were playing around with some pretty cool assets. I won't like spoil your project if you're like itching to release it as something cool, but
it's okay. I mean, and for anyone who hasn't seen the little videos I released, so I started with some real simple orbs, glowing orbs and reflective surfaces, and then everyone's like, oh, is there nanite in there? What's it, the nanite? And it's like, yeah, it's the simple static meshes in the scene, but it's not really taking advantage of nanite. So I actually grabbed the city sample buildings from the Matrix demo, which you can find on the marketplace, and I brought those into the scene, and I totally expected everything to crash and break, but very very quickly, I was able to fly around the city in VR with like full nanite quality there. And if you're using something like the VR editor mode, you can even turn on the debug view modes for nanite and Lumen to see like just how many triangles you're processing. But then when you go back into the normal mode, to be able to zoom from super far away and then fly right up to like all the details of like a statue or a sculpture on one of these buildings is really quite breathtaking.
Yeah, it is. And it's one of those experiences that I know both of us have spent a lot of time in VR looking at architecture in particular. And I felt like when I was working on that, it always felt like making sacrifices.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, the hope or the dream, I guess, is that by enabling nanite in these use cases, that all of a sudden you can really get the detail and kind of artistic qualities you're looking for while making fewer sacrifices, right? Yeah, and I'm very excited about it.
A couple other quick things I should mention. People have been asking about what I'm running this on. I have a laptop with an RTX 3080M, as I'll call it, the mobile version, which is different actually from the desktop 3080. Some people don't know that, so just want to point that out. And Lumen and Nanite for VR are only currently supported with 5.1 using a desktop configuration. You're not going to get it running on a Quest or a Vive Focus 3 or anything like that.
Right, he has a Quest. You might see this Quest behind it, but you're using the link cable there.
Yeah, so that's plugged in. And AirLink would work fine too. You could absolutely do it wireless. That's no problem.
Sure. Cool. So the other big thing that's happened this week.
Busy week.
Yeah, so Alex and I, we spent a full week kind of getting immersed in virtual production.
Yeah.
And this is something I was super excited to jump into. So we spent a week learning about this stuff at an LED wall. And man, I learned so much.
Me too.
There's really, it's a pretty incredible thing because I think kind of looking at virtual production from the side of someone who's coming from Unreal or other use cases, you kind of expect people to follow similar workflows to what you're using today, but they are completely different, aren't
Totally different, yeah. Yeah, and if you look at some of the marketing videos for things like The Mandalorian and other productions like Thor: Love and Thunder that have used LED walls in a really meaningful way, it looks like everyone there knows exactly what they're doing and their workflow is totally set, and it's like this very confident driving experience. And you might look at something like that, and if you're really excited about getting into virtual production, you might think, oh, there's no room for me there. Like all the experts have already been established, and what I think it's really much more like is probably the early days of ILM. There's a great documentary series on Disney Plus right now called Light and Magic,
which we'll try and link.
We'll try to link all the show notes stuff. Yeah, and they go through just what a crazy workshop sandbox place it was early on, where they're throwing all sorts of stuff at the blue screen and seeing what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I think it was fascinating for me because a lot of the folks, it seems, that have kind of jumped into virtual production are folks who came from like live entertainment.
Yeah,
which was not necessarily something that I was expecting, though it makes total sense now that I think about it. Right, like it makes a lot of sense that if you were like doing live events for concerts or whatever it was, right, and you were operating LED walls anywhere, like you would have the skills necessary to do virtual production. It's just about like adding in the Unreal Engine component, right? Yeah. And it's been really fascinating to see how, for example, a lot of the equipment, a lot of the, from my point of view, I'm an infrastructure and hardware guy. Like seeing how they kind of compose things is very interesting because it's kind of completely different from the way we would handle like normal workflows in really any industry that Unreal has kind of touched up till now, VFX and automotive and all these other places. So that was really fascinating for me to see and kind of think about how like there's so much work left to be done in virtual production, so that the folks who are specialists in production and in live entertainment and whatever it is, like so that they can operate with folks who know a lot about Unreal at the same plane, right? Yeah. Like there's a ton of tooling. I feel like we had a ton of discussions all week about like, oh, it'd be really cool if I had a tool that did X, Y, Z, that set up my scene in some way, or like adjusted lights for me, or handled the sync of the displays and stuff like that. There's really such an amazing amount of work to be done there.
Yeah, I mean, it almost makes me think of hearing again, actually, this was featured in the Light and Magic series. George Lucas talking about the hassle of dealing with physical film, and him kind of dreaming even back in the 1970s of, wouldn't it be great to have all this just exist on like a computer, and we could do all of our editing and cutting that way, and it would be so simple. So that desire to have a level of automation and having everything kind of pre-configured and set up, and have things be speedy and to be able to iterate very fast. Like, that's most virtual production, in my understanding now, isn't quite there yet. Even if you're someone who specializes in like LED wall configurations, you're going to find from one LED wall to the other, you can't necessarily bring one kind of setup with you for every one of them. They're all going to have their own eccentricities, and there's not a lot of standardization between how all these different systems talk to each other. So there's a lot of room for innovation there.
And it's also, I mean, on kind of a nerdier side, like a lot of this, well, one of the comments I was kind of making was, when you take these LED walls and you're moving them around and you're kind of taking them place to place, that's very much live entertainment. Yeah. It's the kind of thing where you set them up and they are, you load the project file for the touring group that you're with, right? Like, you set that up, you have it working, and usually, there's not a whole lot that changes, so everything's fine. Yeah. Right. But what is pretty interesting is that these walls are now being kind of parked, right? They're fixed kind of studios. And as soon as you do that, it becomes infrastructure, and all of a sudden there's all these new challenges about, okay, how do we not just accommodate one artist? Like, how do we accommodate tons of different assets? How do we accommodate, productions coming in and out? And I think that's really pretty fascinating in terms of, like, also things that Unreal Engine was not prepared to do, right? Like,
yeah, there's a lot.
The number of times we swore off Perforce,
I know,
is incredible. So I think there's a ton of stuff there, and I'm just really excited to see kind of what people do, to be honest. On top of what people make, right? Like, I think there's just a ton of tooling and stuff like that I think it's gonna be awesome.
And I would just encourage anyone who's a tinkerer, who really is passionate about this space and wants to get into it. There's a lot of opportunities to do that. Start by learning N-Display and the switchboard system in Unreal. Maybe start playing with some of the other software that interfaces with that. There's a lot of YouTube videos that cover this kind of stuff. And you can start by basically having your own quote-unquote LED wall set up with a couple monitors, like the ones Jacob has behind us here. And those you can use action figures or something like that, and treat those as human scale
that'd be
people.
Fun, actually. I might try that now.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You can do it with a home setup. You don't need something crazy. With an asterisk, like we're saying, this stuff is not completely solved. So you're gonna have to kind of expect you're gonna hit some walls here and there. Yeah. But that's really the fascinating part of being part of the Unreal Engine community right now, is watching how fast this is growing, and watching how many different kinds of people are getting involved. Right? That's really a mark of a sort of transformative technology. Even though Unreal is very old in that sense, right? Like it's very old compared to a lot of the stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis with technology, and yet the stuff that VFX and these studios are doing are even older than that, right? Yeah. So it's pretty cool to see all this stuff come back together, really.
Absolutely. And I should mention, I'm realizing that when we were talking about Lumen and Nanite at the beginning of the conversation, I mentioned that, there's all sorts of things that it hasn't been compatible with. And I think I threw out the term ICVFX, which stands for in-camera visual effects. That's something that often happens in virtual production. And again, everyone using virtual production for the most part has stayed in 4.27 because that has been pretty stabilized for things like virtual production. And Unreal Engine 5, still not quite there for virtual production. Nanite works, but not Lumen. And 5.1, once that comes out, just like VR, starts to add all these features back into a virtual production pipeline. And hopefully, we start to see more innovation and more workflows being developed with these new tools available.
Yeah, I think there's definitely good starting points today to go out and get started with this stuff. So similar to Alex, if you're interested in this, if you want to become a part of virtual production, I would just get out there and start trying it. Just literally set up your monitors and do it like Alex said. I think that's a great idea. I got some like, you know, bobbleheads over there, like I'll do it, you know. I think that's really a great way to start, because you might think that your home setup is very different from like what folks out there are doing, but everyone's still figuring this stuff out.
Yeah.
Like no one has the kind of ideal solution. Everyone's still experimenting. So 100%. Like, I think it's a cool space though. One of the things that I'm really excited for is just like how many different ways you can use the same space.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like,
yeah.
And we were talking about iteration times right now. There's still a lot of acceleration that can happen, but the fact of the matter is it's still significantly faster than traditional pipelines.
Yeah.
So like it's also very cool to think about how much further we could come to the point where, you know, studios all of a sudden can do tons of work in a day.
Yeah.
And you know, this is maybe kind of getting on a tangent, but I'm pretty fascinated to see how virtual production changes this industry in general. Mm-hmm. You know, not just for the, you know, Unreal or the technology. One of the things that's kind of been happening, or I've seen inside of media entertainment, is everyone's kind of talking about the kind of influx of content with particularly streaming services, you know, yeah. HBO, Netflix, etc. And there are a lot of folks out there, or a lot of studios out there, who all of a sudden, you know, getting to kind of grab at way more franchises and getting to kind of take on way more shots, just because like content is being funded more long form. And you know, if you're producing 10 one-hour episodes, you're going to have way more VFX shots than even something like a film, right? Mm-hmm. So these series take a ton of effort, and more people are getting involved. What might happen, I'm assuming, is that, you know, this could continue to happen. Like, we could continue to see content grow over time, because things like virtual production make it more accessible for folks to go out there and iterate or be a part of more productions at once, right? Mm-hmm. At one time, you could only be a part of one or two like major productions, and there were plenty of places where it was just one and everyone was focused. But nowadays, and maybe with virtual production, all of a sudden you can get a lot done. Yeah. And I'm really excited to see kind of where that goes.
And these stages are growing incredibly fast. I think in the past year, something like 400 new, you know, LED wall stages or virtual production stages have been constructed. A lot of them, obviously internationally, but a lot of them on the West Coast of the United States. More and more popping up on the East Coast. Yeah. And, you know, I should also mention, too, that if anyone does feel like that they're at a level here where they can do something really exciting and they're looking for work, actually reach out, because there could be some opportunities on the horizon. So don't be afraid to say, hey, this is something I've been playing with. Here's a few sample projects I messed around with, and we could have a conversation.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think I haven't quite lost the thread that I was on, but that was an important comment. So no, 100%. Definitely reach out. I think it's interesting to see kind of where the industry is going in terms of also the cost effectiveness of you know, recording and staging things. You know, we spent a week and we kind of learned a lot, and I feel like just a matter of time before there's a lot of people who can be very competent and doing this very quickly. And one of the things that happens across the VFX industry is that folks, you know, they go out there. If you're making a movie, you might say, okay, I have 1,500 shots, and a bunch of studios might bid on some of those shots. As the cost of, you know, production goes down with things like, you know, virtual production, it's going to be pretty fascinating to see how kind of everyone in the industry has to respond. Yeah. Because there's a pretty large chance that there's a good number of folks who are kind of going to have to get on this train, so that, you know, they can make sure that they bid and are able to get work. Just because they're competing against a bunch of people who can maybe produce content faster or produce more iterations, or maybe their work is better because they get a chance to access different talent pools, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like, there's so many interesting effects that this kind of stuff could have on even the content you see at home. So like, even if you're not invested in this, chances are you're going to see the effects of this happening probably much quicker than you're expecting, right? Like Mandalorian had a pretty huge effect across this industry when it comes to thinking about how to make new productions.
Yeah. Yeah, and just the idea that this can all happen inside a real-time game engine like Unreal is pretty incredible. I don't think anyone thought 20 years ago that the kinds of things people were doing video games on could actually support an actual feature film or high prestige television series.
Yeah, 100%. And there's so many cool people out there who are doing exactly that. You know,
exactly.
out there making, you know, shows or making feature films, and there's really so much amazing content or like content on its way or out there already, right? Like I think it's pretty impressive to see how people are jumping on this technology.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I think Jacob and I were discussing would be a fun thing to do every week is just a little highlight of something that caught our eye of something going on. And like, this is not going to be a news show. We're not going to actively be seeking out like, what are the 10 things you need to know from what happened this week? Not our bag. But I thought every week would be kind of fun to do something. So like this week, something that caught my eye, my friend Kevin Labson brought this to attention. Brielle Garcia had a really cool post on Twitter where they were using a Marilyn Monroe-esque metahuman and had that metahuman moving around, but then he used something called Deepface Lab, which allowed for a real-time deepfake to be mapped onto the metahuman's face to make this one look more like Marilyn Monroe. And with all the mouth movements and everything going on with the character, that now looked exactly like it was Marilyn Monroe's face. Now, it's interesting to talk about something like the Uncanny Valley, because I saw some people saying, like, it doesn't quite look like Marilyn Monroe, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And as far as I could tell, if you paused any frame of what was going on there, it did look like Marilyn Monroe, but the movements, that can have another uncanny valley to it, because the way you capture, whether you're using, you know, a lower end or a higher end motion capture system, whatever you're doing for the face, it can start to feel a little robotic, a little wooden. And at that point, no matter how excellent the capture is, or how excellent the model is and the deep faking going on with the face, it's still going to feel a little bit off. And so, you know, there's several kinds of Uncanny Valley, and I don't think everyone always thinks about that. It's not just how something looks.
That's like metahumans in general, though,
absolutely.
right? Like what we saw with the Matrix demo,
Yeah.
and, you know, meta Keanu Reeves and such. There was a huge number of people who were like, that looks nothing like Keanu Reeves, and a huge number of people were like, wow, that's the coolest thing ever. That looks exactly like Keanu Reeves. And I think it's not like an experience thing. It's not like you look at so many, you know, rendered images, or you spend so much time in Unreal, and all of a sudden you can detect metahumans. This is a natural physiological thing that, like, you are programmed to detect even the slightest, you know, differences with reality. And with faces and people are one of the things, like, we are most heavily programmed to be able to detect. And so with something like that, I think that's probably a lot of what's going on, is like, even if it was almost perfect, people would have such a strong sense that it would be so difficult to achieve.
Exactly. And so, Brielle does all sorts of very cool projects in Unreal Engine, as well as programs like Snap and other things. Follow them on Twitter at TacoLamp if you get the chance. And thanks, Brielle, for everything you do. It's very exciting. I think maybe one other thing we should touch base on before the end of today's podcast is, for anyone who's watching this on YouTube, you might be wondering, like, why the heck do we look like how we look?
Good point.
What's going on with
that,
that, Jacob?
Mention that at the end of the episode.
At the very end, yeah.
Yeah, we got, so Alex showed up at my lovely apartment here with 4 Azure Connects, and we spent quite a lot of time trying to get them all set up. We had a few issues with the USB, and
they take a very specific kind of USB cord, and they need a lot of USB power.
Yeah, they need a lot of bandwidth, so we weren't able to get 4 working, but we thought this was cool enough. Yeah. You know, to be an interesting visual for the podcast. So, I don't know, let us know what you think. If you want us to keep doing weird, crazy visuals of, you know, random technology, because Alex has a lot in his closet.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I'm fortunate to get to play with a lot of this stuff a little early sometimes. And the Kinect I've been playing with for years now. I've been very excited about how volumetric capture, especially in VR, starts to bridge that uncanny valley a little bit. And also, I feel like, again, there's always going to be someone who's listening to the podcast and is like, I don't really know what the uncanny valley is.
Yeah,
so would you like to give a brief definition?
Sure. So the uncanny valley is a point at which graphics become so realistic that you're actively kind of, I guess, perturbed or disturbed by them.
Yeah.
It's a point. It's like a very specific point at which it's no longer cartoonish or stylized. It's clear that it's attempting to replicate the real world, so to speak. But it doesn't quite hit it, or even sometimes like it surpasses it to the extent that like maybe portions of the image are incorrect, but some are so accurate.
Yeah.
Like the contrast even can be deterrent.
Unsettling.
Unsettling, yeah. And I think one of the greatest examples of this was NVIDIA once did a demo with, they did it with like, I think 8, at the time it must have been Turing or the generation before Volta, 8 of the, I think it was like Quadro 6000s of the guy's face. Do you remember that? It was like a bald guy with a face, and he was doing all these mouth movements, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, this is so weird!" Like it was a little too real, and everyone was like, "I don't know if I like this."
Yeah.
But the Uncanny Valley is just a kind of a huge debate across this industry in general. Like, what do you do with the Uncanny Valley? Do you really attempt to go for it? Is stylization, is Pixar right?
Right.
I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Yeah, like I played a lot with Metahumans, and it's interesting because a lot of what my understanding of what Epic's trying to do there is make it very easy to not be in the Uncanny Valley while still having a very good-looking digital human. But I did find that even within the constraints of what was there, my team and I have had to do a lot of massaging before we find exactly the kind of metahuman that is going to feel good, especially in VR. I think there's even more of a sense of the Uncanny Valley in VR.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, you get dead eyes looking at you, and that's no good, and you want everything to feel as natural as possible.
Yeah, for folks who have never tried VR, one of my tropes, and Alex has probably already heard this multiple times, but is that when you are in VR, it's an essentially different experience. Like, for example, the first, all the Halo games, like Master Chief is like 9 feet tall, right? And you can't tell because when you play Halo or you play, 2D games, it's all just about how it looks on the screen.
Right.
It's all just about how your character compares to its surroundings, and it's really kind of almost impossible to detect that. And yes, you can like pull out your ruler and figure out that Master Chief is 9 feet tall. That's how we know.
Right.
But the thing is, as soon as you get into VR, it is instantly apparent. It's the kind of thing where I remember we had scenes, for example, just like household appliances, and I would be trying to like configure them on my display, inside of Unreal, so that like my fridge looked like a fridge, and I'd be like, okay, that looks good. I would get in, and it would be like 4 feet too tall, right? It would just be completely ridiculous, and it took, I think, quite a while for me to even get close. So it's a very different design constraint. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone wants to try this out for themselves, there's a setting in Unreal Engine in the world settings that allows you to set the world to meters scale. And by default, that's at 100. If you change that setting, you're not going to notice anything feeling different unless you're in VR, just as Jacob was saying.
Yeah.
Like if you're looking at a screen, there's not really a sense of scale. But if you take that slider and bring it down to 50 or bring it up to 200, in VR, you're going to really feel how different the world is.
Yeah, one of my favorite, I'm going to kind of brag here for a second, because sure. one of my favorite mechanics I ever made in VR was I was working on this initial prototype for like a basic like architectural sketching thing in VR where you could like draw walls and connect them. But I spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, how can you like zoom out and like visualize it from top down, floor plans, whatever. And I spent a lot of time on this, and then I decided that the best way to do it was to leave the controllers the same size. They'd be this like little tiny, like what are these controllers for ants, right? Yeah. Like they'd be the same tiny size, but you would continue to grow. And because the controllers were in your hands and you could feel them, that was one way that you could instantly feel the scale without like, you know, kind of having to take your headset off and reset your experience, or you know, trying to, you know, banana for scale like Reddit, right? Like there was really no way to do it, but like if you kept it the same, all of a sudden you had this like instant perspective. It was pretty interesting.
That's funny. I spend a bunch of time trying to make sure that when I have an input in Unreal Engine that changes your world to meter scale, that like everything scales perfectly with it. So you never feel like the controllers are getting too big or too small. But I actually like that as a reference point.
It was something I wasn't expecting. It was probably like a bug or something, right, that I introduced. I can't remember at this point. It's probably like in Blueprints I had the wrong transform or something. But
a bug can be a feature.
Yeah, I remember seeing it. I was like, oh, that works because, like I said, you can feel it in your hand.
Yeah.
So going back to Uncanny Valley, which I realize we've now gone way off track. The Uncanny Valley is just such an interesting thing to talk about in terms of like the larger. I was mentioning that there's so many debates around this, kind of across industries and across conversations. You got the box.
I'm just
okay,
gonna hold
okay.
This. Yeah.
But I think for everyone, it's kind of up to you to decide, you know, what kind of content you consume, right? And I think at the end of the day, one of my goals is to make it clear, you know, what is real and what is fake, and not necessarily try to make decisions for people about like what it is they want to consume, you know, in whatever future we go towards.
Yeah, it's an artistic choice. Exactly. And if someone wants to make something feel very unsettling, that might actually be a decision. They might actually want to have something where you feel like there's something a little bit wrong.
NVIDIA probably didn't think that, but we'll let it slide.
Yeah. I mean, you get things like what happened with Sonic, where like Sonic was instantly redesigned, but then got to pop up in his original form in the Chip and Dale's movie, which I don't know if you watched.
This is like a larger debate about like live action movies, which I think we won't get into. Like if live action Sonic was necessary, and I apologize to anyone who might be watching this who like worked on live action Sonic. You never know. But I think everyone kind of agreed on that one. I feel like we're pretty unanimous on that. Like the first live action Sonic was, you know, not that great. So
my kids loved it.
Yeah.
So tying into this whole Uncanny Valley discussion, we spoke briefly about these Azure Connects and trying to use them for volumetric streaming. One of the reasons why that's been so exciting to me for a while is because often when I'm talking to live performers and they want to have a sense of how they can exist in VR, in the metaverse, in whatever form they're going to be, it becomes this question of, well, what are my choices? And it's like, well, you can be an avatar, and you can be a very simplified avatar that will live in something like VR chat or some existing social VR platform. You can be a very high fidelity avatar, like a metahuman or something like that. And in those cases, there's some benefits that you don't have to look like yourself. You can change all sorts of qualities of how your bone structure works. You could transform into a dragon and control a dragon. That's all cool. And that's one option. But if you want to look more like yourself and really try to bypass anything that could start to approach the Uncanny Valley, then you might want to do green screen or stereoscopic green screen, which will actually have two cameras, a left and a right eye, which can look very good in VR. There's an Oculus Quest game called Supernatural that does that very well with the workout trainers in there. Or you can do volumetric capture. And with volumetric capture, ideally, you're trying to have as much of a 3D model of the person as possible. And just like with traditional animation, what you're actually doing is about 30 times a second, you're generating a new full 3D model of that person. And there's a lot of different companies and plugins that start to play with this. There's an SVF plugin that comes from Microsoft that does this. There's a company called Arcturus, a company called Wild Capture that does this. And so what I'm holding is actually a calibration cube that is meant to sync up multiple Azure Connects so that they all have a sense of where they are in relationship to each other, so that if they're all in a circle or just triangulating, they can start to generate a very high quality 3D mesh streaming in real time. And so this is from a company called Soar. So we're starting to beta test that a little bit. Currently, they only have a Unity plugin, but they are working on an Unreal Engine plugin. And usually volumetric captures take a lot of time to process to look good. And once they're done, you know, they're often like an MP4 file and can actually be pretty lightweight. But to be able to do that live and be able to have a low enough latency that a volumetric capture of a person that feels like a proper 3D hologram can really be interacting with an audience, and maybe the audience is in avatar form, or maybe they exist as video feeds, whatever. That starts to get really exciting to me as a new way for people to interact.
Yeah, honestly, it wasn't even something that I was really aware of. I mean, volumetric capture is like has been a dream for like the next evolution of like 360 video and stuff like that for a while, but not something I'd considered for live performance because I always considered it pretty inconsistent. But the first time we set up these cameras, and we haven't been able to reproduce it since. We stumbled because probably because we need like a USB card or something. But the first time we set it up, I was like, it was capturing like all the wrinkles on my sweatshirt. You could see the like curvature of my face. I was like, wow, this is actually incredible.
Super detailed.
I think I could just watch the point cloud and like actually have like a very good conception of the emotion and scale. So I was pretty fascinated. Also, I should mention for people who are listening in, because Alex has been holding this cube. Right. Alex is holding a maybe like 1.5 foot tall, plastic rectangular box with 4, black Tetris and white, pieces. Tetris like Tetris piece looking markers on them, and we kind of just hold them up while everything gets calibrated. I'm assuming it works probably pretty similar to what used to happen with like AR and QR codes, right? Where they would essentially use the patterns that could be oriented uniquely. Because you can see all of these shapes are asymmetric. It could be oriented uniquely and then pattern matched probably with some sort of screen pattern matching or detection, whatever it is, right? But very cool, and also very easy to calibrate. I would say. A lot of this stuff is not easy to calibrate, so that's always cool to see.
Yeah. Innovation. It's an exciting time to be alive.
So, like, where do you think this stuff is going, though, with volumetric capture?
I hope it keeps going in a direction where it can be as simple as possible. I mean, there is very, very cool potential for even like something like an iPhone between its LiDAR and depth camera and other cameras on there to start to have a very portable solution for doing anything from volumetric capture. In fact, there's an app called Record 3D you can find on your phone, which does that in a pretty cool way. And being able to just get to a point where it's as frictionless as possible for anyone to start to provide a sense of scale and presence, all the things we like about VR, to anyone, even if they're watching it through their computer or their phone, is very exciting to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's this whole kind of movement now with the VTubers or whatever you want to call, like, there's, I think, a natural evolution to live streaming that is way more personal and also captures the same effect you get when you put a VR headset on. Yeah. In the sense that, like, when you put a VR headset on, all of a sudden you feel like you're in the room with whatever it is that's around you. It could be a person. So I'm really fascinated to see, for example, how this could make live events really more personal. I remember, in really, I mean, even today with a lot of stuff that happens inside of, Meta or Oculus, whatever you want to call it, their platform, 360 video was never really something that really captured my attention very much because I always felt that it just, well, quote unquote, felt flat, right? Like it legitimately, it didn't feel any better to me necessarily than a large screen TV where there was a quote unquote cinematographer. That actually, I'm going to remove those quotes. I feel like I'm being offensive to sports photographers who are, I'm sure, extremely talented and dedicated people. So I'm going to take that away. Okay. The cinematographers in sports who are actually guiding the action and giving me the best view. What I think would be interesting, though, is like if, for example, you could do something volumetric where I actually feel like I'm sitting in the stands, or maybe someone spills popcorn on me, and I don't know what it is, right? But there's something more compelling about that to me.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, there's one other app that I was hoping to highlight before we wrap up today's session. It's one that I saw in the Real Time Filmmakers Facebook group. And I thought that sounds amazing. The pitch was basically, hey, would you like to be immersed in Unreal Engine environments and using a green screen start to insert yourself in basically a virtual production capacity into these environments using just your phone. So in the spirit of like where we hope this is going in the future, the advent of like cloud streaming to be able to get Unreal Engine scenes onto something as portable as a phone, and to then use something like the AR detection capabilities, AR kit on an iPhone, for example, to start to move around the environment is very, very cool. So this is something that is really only going to be visible to people watching on the stream, but I do want to just demonstrate the app, which is called Skyglass. It is on test flight.
You have to mention also runs in the cloud.
Yes, in the cloud.
Yeah, so your phone is not doing any of the processing here, so it's running in Unreal Engine.
Yeah, runs in Unreal Engine. You'll actually recognize some of the scenes here. Right now, as I move my phone, it's actually starting to move around the environment. If I had a green screen behind me, I would be putting myself in this environment at this moment, which would be very cool. And I could record a video doing a news broadcast from the subway, which I actually did do with my child. I was like, welcome to the subway. And what's also cool is there's a little game controller here. And then this actually allows me to steer around the Unreal Engine environment. And just once again, to emphasize what Jacob mentioned about this being on the cloud, none of this is actually rendering using my phone's hardware. Essentially, this is the same as running like the Netflix app. I just need to get a video stream, and I need to send a little bit of input data back, the same kind of way you might do something like Bandersnatch on Netflix and have that slight bit of interactivity. But as I move around this environment, this is all being rendered on a computer on the cloud.
Which is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really cool to see how folks are doing this kind of stuff. And I would really love for this kind of stuff to be that bridge, really, for virtual production. Like, for folks who are interested in virtual production, maybe coming from a background where, they set up a green screen in their bedroom and they're like, oh, I want to get into real time. I want to kind of understand and experiment with this. This would be a great way, I think, for someone to get started. Just download an app, and all of a sudden, your background has, background replacement and tracking, and you get perspective. I haven't personally tested it on like a solid green screen. Yeah. But given the results I got, I have a wall in another room that's painted green.
Great.
Given the results I got just with a painted wall, I think I'd be very excited to see what someone could do with a proper setup.
Yeah. Pretty exciting.
Well, I guess we'll cap it there. Thank you so much for listening, watching, and just like we mentioned at the beginning, subscribe to the podcast wherever you're watching or listening, and leave us a rating or a like. We really appreciate it, and let us know what you'd like to see or hear in the next episode.
How can they do that, Jacob? How can they tell us those things?
They can tell us those things in comments on Twitter. He's at iBrews. I think I'm Jacob Feldman 17. Maybe I should fix that. I feel like being 17th is never a good qualifier, but at Jacob Feldman 17.
We could also create a Twitter account for the podcast here, or is there an email address they could send something to us at?
You can 100% contact us at info@uepodcast.com. Now, this is the unofficial Unreal Engine podcast, so we're not associated with Epic Games. No. Et cetera, et cetera. But you can contact us at info@uepodcast.com, and you can, reach all of our feeds at rss.uepodcast.com.
Yeah. A couple final things to wrap up. Please do register for Unreal Fest if you can. It's coming up in mid-October. Jacob and I will both be there. I'm sure we're going to try to do some interviews and try to see as many cool things as we can there. I'm teaching a course on virtual reality, which will be fun because it's based on a course that I've been teaching privately for about 1.5 years now, and I've never been allowed to show any of that to the public. And finally, that'll be something that will be both at Unreal Fest and then posted publicly. I also want to mention that I was on the CG Pro podcast last week. That was a really fun conversation with Edward Dawson Taylor. CG Pro is a very cool company that does a lot of Unreal Engine training. Check that out. This coming week, I'll be on a podcast with Vikas Reddy from Lightwist. Lightwist is another very exciting virtual production app that I'm sure we'll talk about more in a future episode. But I believe that will be live on Tuesday at noon Eastern Standard Time. So keep an eye on the Lightwist or the iBrews Twitter account for more info on that.
Very cool. All right. See you next time.
Thanks, everyone.